Welcome back. I'd like to bring in Sacramento Police Chief Daniel Hahn right now. Chief, some developing news we've been following in just the last few hours. The department announced the arrest of an 18-year-old in the killing of two young people at Arden Fair Mall on Black Friday. The message this sends to the community.
Well, I think there's a lot of messages for this whole incident, but the detectives and officers have been working really hard all weekend long, and this is the culmination of their efforts through the investigation to hold, unfortunately, another very young man responsible for two young people being murdered.
And Chief, we look at just some of the numbers that we've been following and some of the violence that we've been seeing throughout the city. And it's not just Sacramento, you really are seeing this across the country. But how concerned are you about these numbers?
Well, yeah, as you said, across the country, you see dramatic increases in violence. And we don't have as dramatic increase in violence as some of the other cities, but for Sacramento, it's for sure an increase. We're at least 39 murders so far this year, and all of last year we had 34. Our aggravated assaults are significantly up. We've seen rashes of shootings over the last several months, and then of course this last weekend we see two young people murdered in a somewhat crowded mall. So it's very concerning. We hope to get that turned around. Fortunately, for the last couple of years, we've had 0 juveniles murdered in our city, which is significant for Sacramento. And so far this year, 4 young people, juveniles, have been killed in our city. So it's definitely a reversal of what we've seen over the last couple of years.
Well, and what do you attribute that to? I mean, a lot of folks will say the pandemic, they point to the pandemic, but are there certain things in particular that you attribute this violence to?
Yeah, I think we make a mistake when we try to oversimplify it and boil it down to 1 or 2 issues. I think this is a culmination of a lot of issues, long-standing issues in our neighborhood, long-standing historical reasons why some of our communities are the way they are. I think the pandemic plays a role in a few different ways. I think our protests around the country have played a role. So, for example, our specialty units, whether it's our problem-oriented policing officers or our gang officers, they've been pulled out of our communities to work protests. So they haven't had a presence, haven't been working as much as they normally do in our communities. You have issues where schools are shut down, sports are shut down, community centers are shut down due to the pandemic. And so there's many things that play into this, and I think we make a big mistake when we try to oversimplify it and say it's because of one issue or another.
I saw the statement from Mayor Steinberg over the weekend, and he said that he will never change his belief that commitment that investing in job creation, workforce training, affordable housing, and community amenities is the ultimate answer to reducing violence in the city. He says this wanton shooting of young people by other young people also demands a strong, proactive law enforcement response. It's not an either or. He says he supports the police department and its officers in doing whatever is legally necessary to take the guns out of the hands of teenagers, period. He supports any effort to strengthen gang enforcement units and hold shooters responsible for their actions. So I see at least 3 things there that the mayor is honing in on. This notion of getting guns out of the hands of young folks, strengthening gang enforcement, and holding shooters responsible for their actions. What do you think of those, Chief?
Well, yeah, obviously, if you don't have a gun in your hand, you can't shoot somebody, but that doesn't mean you can't do something else. And so I do think any efforts that we can for logical gun laws and keeping guns out of the hands of young people or other people that aren't having guns are worthwhile, but those are dealing with the condition. We still have to deal with why do we live in a society where a young 18-year-old person is even willing to shoot another young person? And so we have to approach it by all angles. So do we need law enforcement involved and proactive? Absolutely. Do we need groups like Brother to Brother to be working in the malls and working with families and helping people get out of those sort of situations? Absolutely. Do we need to make sure that our schools are serving everybody? Absolutely. So It's all of the above for the long-term solution. And I think we fall short if we don't realize that there's a lot of things that play into what culminates in a 18-year-old person shooting a 19 and 17-year-old person.
Chief, you know, you say often, you remind us often, this is your city, place you grew up in, love. Do you take it personally when you see this type of violence happening in your city? Do you feel that there's something that you have not done that you could have, should have, would have done that might have prevented this type of spike in violence?
Well, I look at it like you say, this is a city have lived in my whole life. I think there's things that we as a society absolutely could have done, should do, and should start doing. So we don't have a person that's 17 and 19-year-old losing life and an 18-year-old that is essentially going to lose their life because they're going to get locked up for a really long time. And not to mention, we have other family members. I think the family today mentioned that some of the other family members and friends that were there watched their family members or friends die. My younger brother was killed, and I had to identify him while he was dead. And I was a grown man. I was a police officer when that happened. So I can't imagine at 13, 14, 15 years old, having to see your brother or your good friend laying on the ground dying. And so we live in a society that, this country has so many resources and so much ability that we should be doing something about this. This should be a wake-up call to all people, not just this shooting, but the other shootings that have been occurring in our neighborhoods. We should be all coming together to try to figure out how we can change the lives of young people so they don't feel the desire, the need to take somebody's life over any reason.
Very powerful, Chief, to hear you just reflect on your own personal experience of losing your loved one to violence. Tell me then, short term, what specific things will you be doing, if anything, to try and stem this violence?
Well, first and foremost, investigate this crime. And we still have a lot of witnesses. We're still calling for people that know information. We're at the mall to call us and be interviewed. So first and foremost, we owe it to this family and our community to investigate this crime and hold anybody responsible for it accountable. When we have things crop up, not only do we as police officers move our resources around to try to stem any retaliation or any threat of violence, but we have a pretty large network. Again, I mentioned Brother to Brother earlier, there's Sister to Sister, and many other organizations that also mobilize and work in the community. So we're not the same, but we all are working towards the same goal. I think a lot of those resources coming together have been some of the reason why we haven't had any juveniles killed over the last couple years. And so it's all of us working together to, one, prevent a shooting, but also ensure that our young people and grown folks for that matter too, don't resort to killing somebody, whether it's a disagreement or whatever the reason might be. There's better ways to handle it, obviously. And instead, now we have a family, both of siblings and parents, that lost two of their family members in the same moment. And so it's not just the two young men that died. It's their family that have to now go on and deal with this and figure out a way to move forward for their other family members after two of them died. Again, you had people as young as like 13 years old in the mall at that moment, watch this happen, that watched their or family members die. And just imagine at 13 years old having to deal with that. I too, when I was about 9 years old, witnessed a murder in front of my house. And so I know what that's like. I don't know what watching my brother get murdered is like. And so I can't imagine. So we should all feel an obligation to ensure that this doesn't continue. And there's simple solutions. It's all of us working together and ensuring that lives of young people are much more productive and much more engaging, and so they don't resort to things like this. And what makes it even harder right now is we're in the middle of a pandemic that limits your ability to do that. Sports are canceled, schools are canceled. So things where our young people come engaged with good people, productive people, those have been limited now because they're canceled while we can't be together. And school is now on Zoom, and mental health is raised since the classes have been on Zoom. So young people are having more mental health challenges. I know you've probably done stories on it where our mental health professionals say they've had increased calls from adults and young people. Impact SAC has youth now trained in mental health. So groups are trying, but in this time right now, it's even more challenging because the possibilities that we can do in our communities, at our community centers, at our schools, are limited due to the pandemic. So hopefully, in that way, it is related in somewhat because it limits our ability to, as a society, to engage our youth and keep them in productive things around good people that can mentor them.
Chief, I don't want to hold you long, but I do want to say I do expect the mayor to join us here in just a moment, probably the next 2-3 minutes. If you'd like to be with us, we would love to have you. But I just want to get your thoughts on, the whole defund the police movement that we saw during the height of some of the protests, and now we're seeing some of this violence. Talk to me about, because they will say we never meant to defund the police. We meant to reallocate resources to things like mental health. Take some of the funding. City, for example, 60% of the budget goes to police. Take some of that money and let's use that for youth services or things like that. Let's allocate funding for those things from police toward. What are your thoughts about that as we face this uptick in violence?
Yeah, I think that definition of defund depends on who you talk to. Some people do mean eliminate the police department. Some people mean reduce the funding and give it to somewhere else. The reality is for here in Sacramento, and I won't talk about any other city because I don't know any city like I know this. If defunding the Sacramento Police Department means less officers and less professional staff on an already understaffed department, our city will be less safe. We won't have the resources to do some of the things that we even do today. But I do absolutely believe that we absolutely need to rethink how we serve our community as a whole. So, as you know, the city has instituted a new department, Office of Community Response. And I think there are some opportunities for social workers or other sort of trained people to respond to certain calls. But the reality is there's violence in our city, and the best people to respond to violence are police officers. And then once that violence is taken care of, then another group can come and respond and be better equipped to help our community get the resources that they need so we don't have to keep responding. So I think there is a lot of room for us to or decide new ways to respond to certain things in our community. But right now, if we are reducing the number of police officers in an already short department, our community will absolutely be less safe, in my opinion.
If anything, you're saying you need more funding.
We absolutely need more police officers. We need more professional staff. But I also think there's different ways we can respond to certain things in our community. And we need to blur the line between institutions like social work and law enforcement and integrate them more. And so we get better, more appropriate services to people in crisis in our community so they can get out of that crisis more frequently than they do right now.
That I think that's a really powerful statement to hear the chief say, because I think one of the things that you've talked about is, look, you'll take a good idea from anybody. You know what I mean? That you're looking for solutions as we deal with this. How was it for you, Chief, to watch this weekend as we saw Black Friday, children and people running from again? Remember, this isn't the first time we saw these type of things happening at the mall. Last time we had the melee around this time last year. Anything that you'd like to see or changes you'd like to see when it comes to, especially around the holidays? Or are you going to be increasing patrols at the malls and these types of things?
Well, yeah, we had officers at the mall that day, and Brother to Brother was at the mall that day, and it still happened. And so always the balancing act that you have to do. Our country is built around our freedoms and our ability to live free lives and not be, whether it be over policed or over regulated. And so, those are things that we hold very dear in this country. And so we always have to find a fine balance of how do we keep people safe and yet not infringe on people's freedoms. And so, my thoughts this weekend when I was watching that on the news is, one, for the family who just lost 2 young members of their family, but also just the impact it has on the people that were around also, that saw it or that were in the area or that had to run out of the mall in a location you wouldn't think you'd have to run from, that you wouldn't think that there would be a shooting at. And what is the impact on people? What are they thinking about tomorrow if they go to the mall? They're walking past a homicide scene. They're thinking about this. And it's just not something that in a healthy community you want people to be fearful of or worried about in terms of a shooting.
So should people be fearful, Chief? Should people be fearful? Should people be concerned?
Well, in the sense that this wasn't an act where people were running through the mall indiscriminately shooting at people. And it's not like this happens every day at the mall. So on one hand, no, but the reality is people are going to be fearful of it. This was all over every news station for hours that night, and 2 young people died. So the reality is we hope for whatever we want, but the reality is people are going to be fearful at it. There are going to be people that would have gone to the mall this week that do not go to the mall this week because of that. And so that's one of the reasons why we have to find the people responsible and hold them accountable, like through the arrest we had today. And then if there's any new ways we can help keep the mall safe, we will. The mall has to think about that too. But I think in general, no, malls are for the most part very safe, but the reality is people are going to be thinking about it.
Chief, are there things I have not asked you that you'd like to leave with us? Like I said, this is an opportunity. We wanted the public to hear from you. We'll put this thing in its entirety on our YouTube page where people can hear what you are feeling and some of your thoughts. I think people a lot of times look for silver bullets in these scenarios. They want to know, okay, well, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, and this is going to stop this from happening again. But I just want to be clear, when we look to you and we say, Chief, what are we going to do to prevent this from happening in our city again? What is your response?
Yeah, I just think we have to recommit collectively as a community to, are guns important? Yes. Are they easier to get to? Yes. But the reality is it's the people behind the guns. We have to address the fact that we have increasing numbers this year of young people, whether they're juveniles or just young adults, 18 or 19, that are shooting at each other, that are being violent with each other. And we have to figure out how do we change lives of those young people. So the answer is not violence. And when we get that, and when we're able to do that in all of our communities, we will see a precipitous drop in violent crime.